creation, tajdid al-khalq, of creation happening all the time. And so the lessons, the ayat, are unfolding all the time in different people's lives. So fresh experience is what he was talking about. And that can come from our dreams, from conflicts with, new tests and trials, ibtila, bala. We don't, but the point is that it's fresh, it was more through Persian poets, in particular Rumi and Hafez, that I first, especially when I was living and studying in Iran, as you are, that I was first drawn into this way of looking at life and experience. The terms, what is fascinating about Ibn Arabi, he explains these terms from the Quran in a way that demands that the listener find the experience, the equivalence in their own experience. It's what he calls tahqiq. And certainly there's nothing more batin and inside than the hub. If we were happy all the time, we forget God, we forget the haq, the reality. Always have to be turning around to find that light. And so love is the engine of that process. Love is not a destination. Love is the dynamic that makes life. It's clear that beauty is inseparable from the awakening of love, shall we say. Huwa jamilun wa yuhibbul jamal. Rango khada is just sibqatullah, ma ahsanullahi sibqatan. Ya mu'allif al-qulub. It's the what you're experiencing there is mu'allif al-qulub. The divine power to marry souls and marry hearts so that people can go ahead and move ahead in life. I would say each of these kinds of experiences of haq is a kind of thread. If you can say, it's like it's put in your hand, and if you pull on it, then you spend the rest of your life exploring what that ayah contains. Well, when they hear what is descended from God, you see their eyes fill up with tears. Tears as the true sign of that kind of of that kind of understanding of the alastu birabukum, if you will, that kind of primordial awakening in the soul, that ability. Whether you say tejliyat or madahir or the word, there are many words for that kind of awareness of God's presence from hadara, but it's not the theology or the technology of the words. What's important is the actual presence. I think everyone has the experience of something that is so much larger than themselves, their ego. Words don't suffice to communicate what's going on in terms of that communication. So this is not tears of sadness, it's the opposite. It's tears of joy and recognition and connection. I think that's, I go back to your dua or your saying of Hazrat Zainab there, that how can this beauty, so infinite beauty, be here in this world? We didn't do it. Ma ramaita idh ramaita lakin Allah rama. That in all of those situations, you get your ego out of the way and you'll see. And when you see that, like an Allah rama, that it was God who was doing the acting in those situations, again, you kind of have this inner just awe and astonishment that the Quran calls them awliyaullah, la khawf alayhim wa la yahzanun. When you run into people like that, those worries you have somehow go, where'd they go? Why am I not afraid of dying? Why am I not afraid of punishment and so forth? Being of salam, this beam of salam, of peace that they transmit in the world, that's what answers these questions about fear of dying and fear of punishment. The deep connection of love that makes this, that brings creation into being, also puts human beings in this position of being the instruments of ruju, of return. Not only that they're returning themselves, but they're the instruments of God's love for carrying back everyone else towards that source. What stands out with Ali is his commitment and his self-sacrifice to make that teaching a reality in which people can live. But Ali manages to integrate all of that outward work of dunya with the highest spiritual awareness of God and of the deepest reality of the Prophet Muhammad. In my own experience, I would say the more you come to know Ali, the more you come to know the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the reality of Ali is clear not only in the akhbar that are translated and in his writings, but in the lives and teachings of all of the Imams. Jafar as-Sadiq said this, Muhammad Baqir said this, others close to them, Zainab's not an Imam, but she is. I mean, she's a voice of the Imams. Spiritual understanding is something else that is much more constantly demands our connection with God and with the instruments of God, the awliya. I want to feel that when I'm gone, I will have touched as many lives as possible. But the Sufi phrase, "Motu qabla an tamut," die before you die. And nasu niyam, people are asleep. Well, in a way, that sleep is kind of a death. With a matun tabahu.
الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. We are honored today. This is our second interview with Professor Ustad James Mوريس. 2 years ago, we had our first interview with him, and we'd like to delve with him in the realms of spirituality, mysticism, Sufi studies, Ibn Arabi and Rumi studies, and to gain some of his wisdom, light, and experience throughout all the years. So, Assalamu alaikum and welcome, Professor.
Yeah.
Professor James Mوريس was a professor in the Department of Theology at Boston College with a program in Islamic societies and civilizations. Throughout his academic journey, Professor Mوريس has completed his PhD from Harvard University and studied also in the American University in Cairo and the Iranian Academy of Philosophy in Tehran, and has taught in several universities such as Princeton University and the University of Exeter in London. His interests include Islamic philosophy, Islamic mysticism, Sufi studies, Arabic and Persian literature. He has published the following books: The Wisdom of Throne, Al-Hikmah Al-Arshiyya, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Mullah Sadra, The Reflective Heart, Discovering Spiritual Intelligence in Ibn Arabi's Meccan Illuminations, Knowing the Spirit, a translation of Ma'rifat al-Ruh li Nur Ali Ilahi, and many other articles such as Seeking God's Face, Discovering the Dance of Walaya and Wilaya, What is Wali, Transfiguring Love in the Ghazals of Hafidh, and other articles about Hafidh, Rumi, Ibn Arabi, and Mullah Sadra. He is leading a very beautiful seminar in Islamic mysticism, which is called Ibn Arabi Seminar in Boston, in Harvard University, with a group of students and seekers of such knowledge. He is a well-known teacher of Islamic mystical and Sufi studies for a wide range of different students around the globe due to his experience in this heritage and texts throughout all these decades. So in the beginning, so you're in the 8th decade of your life and you have a valuable intellectual and spiritual experience. So do you still find religious and Sufi studies, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and other Sufi masters, Quran and sacred texts, beautiful, fascinating, attracting, adding continuous insight to you? In the last few years also you're being concentrating on divine love, باب المحبة الإلهية أو الحب الإلهي in فتوحات المكية of Ibn Arabi. So what's the secret and mystery of this heritage, texts and realities where it takes the whole life of professors, truth seekers, and researchers like you.
Yeah, it may take beyond this life as well, So I think that's one of the things that the really apt students, the ones with the right istiadad, they are well aware that our learning proceeds through God, in Mari's language, billah, through God and with God. And so one of the things that I appreciate a lot more now, especially now that I just recently retired, just in the last semester, is that these things only, their worth is only all the different traditions you mentioned and the different texts and great hakims that you mentioned. It only makes sense in relationship to people and their lives. They don't, books can sit in libraries, manuscripts, but what's really always important is the living books, both of teachers and of students. And as a teacher, everything I learn from my students. I think the last time you interviewed me, I said I learned from my children, but they're not always my students, but you learn from other people and their experiences. That's in terms of say, Ibn Arabi's thought, he talks about creation, tajdid al-khalq, of creation happening all the time. And so the lessons, the ayat, are unfolding all the time in different people's lives. So that you only become aware of that more and more as you get older, simply because you've met more people, you've traveled more, you've seen how life works. And so, yeah, I continue to learn from those books that you mentioned, but above all, I learn from the people I get fortunate enough to get to teach them to. You mentioned the Bab al-Hub, which I am still doing a seminar on at Harvard in the Futuhat, but that no one person in their lifetime can begin to experience all the different facets of love that Ibn Arabi talks about. So the best way to learn is to be not a top-down teacher who tells people what to believe, but in a circle, a majlis, hawza, where not necessarily the way all hawzas function, but in a circle of seminar where each person can explain what they're learning about the subject in question. And so that's where I learn. And I really miss having more students. Right now I'm trying to figure out new ways to move beyond the Boston area seminar and do more things online. Again, it's just hard to figure out exactly how to have everyone in the same level when you're at a screen and you're looking at lots of pictures and Zoom. It's not easy to figure out how to transform that into the equivalent of an in-person seminar, but you do this all the time, so I'm sure you could teach me more about how to do teaching online. So, yeah.
So, Professor, each person is a نفخة روح إلهية, is a special manifestation of God. He has a certain الوجه الخاص towards his creator. So, and you believe in that, and you are seeking knowing people from their spirits and from their relations towards God.
Yeah, and I think the only advantage I can see, the main advantage of getting older is and this is true whether you're going from 20 to 30 or 30 to 50, as you get older, you begin to be less shy about actually sharing your qalb, what's going on. And the most important learning is always things that we're a little shy about, or we don't want to share with just anyone. We want to share with people who help you to understand the ayat in your life. And that is one advantage, is you learn that life is short and you can't afford to only say things will not I'm saying how to put this, but things that are new, that Ibn Arabi's teacher, one of his teachers, Abu Madjan of Algeria, the very famous Sufi sheikh who taught they only met in the ghaib, in the barzakh. But he always told his students, bring me fresh meat. In the days before refrigeration, meat didn't keep very long. And so that fresh experience is what he was talking about. And that can come from our dreams, from conflicts with, new tests and trials, ibtila, bala. We don't, but the point is that it's fresh, and especially I think in the world of dreams and things that happen there, time doesn't matter too much. You can be dreaming about something that happened 20 years ago, and it's actually telling you a lesson about that you haven't fully assimilated. So this is how Sheikhs always taught. I'm just saying I'm only in my old age. I'm beginning to learn why they taught that way.
Yeah. So we'd like to gain some of your fresh meat today, inshallah, hopefully. So I'll begin about love, Professor, because you're working on this topic from 2 or 3 years ago on the Futuhat al-Makkiyya, Bab al-Mahabba. And my question is not only intellectually, so it's about also your personal life and experience of faith, if you'd like to reflect on some things and so on. So why is the theme of love very central in Sufism or maybe in the Quran also? What's the essence of that? And there's a famous poem of Ibn Arabi, أدين بدين الحب أن نتوجه فالحب ديني. So just let us begin on the importance and the centrality of love in the path towards God.
Well, let me say, since you're asking these questions from your home base in Iran at the moment, that it was more through Persian poets, in particular Rumi and Hafez, that I first, especially when I was living and studying in Iran, as you are, that I was first drawn into this way of looking at life and experience. And so what I find fascinating about Ibn Arabi is, as usual, he has the experiential side of the great poets, the great Sufi poets who often wrote in Persian, but he also has the scriptural side of the Quran and Hadith. And I had not realized, frankly, how central the theme of God's love is in the Quran until I started working on this chapter. When I say working on it, the hardest thing you can do, or the most educational thing you can do, is to try and translate texts like this so that their meanings can come across in another language. And when you read them in Arabic, it's filled with Quran and Hadith that are familiar and so forth. But if you're thinking about getting them to wider audiences today, including Muslims as well as non-Muslims who aren't so familiar with the tradition, it's like any translation has to be a very extensive commentary. And, you have to explain why this passage from the Quran about, yuhibbul mutahirin, something, all these phrases which explain what God loves. The terms, what is fascinating about Ibn Arabi, he explains these terms from the Quran in a way that demands that the listener find the equivalence in their own experience. It's what he calls tahqiq, from haqqaqa, to be a muhakkik. And it's one thing to say everybody would like to discover the truth of reality, but his language is so amazing in terms of its ability to bring up that reality. Just like, in fact, you wouldn't think of matching up the two maybe with Khaja Hafez of Shiraz and Ibn Arabi, but in fact, they're both muhakkikun. They're both trying to write in such a way that the reader is obliged to go inside to find out what they're actually talking about. And certainly there's nothing more batin and inside than the hub, So that's why I have to decide at this point in life, I have to decide which things I'm going to focus on. I can't count on decades and decades to come. So I think this is a subject that everyone can relate to, no matter what their background, their religion, whatever. I would say that in this long chapter, it's almost 100 pages of very densely printed Arabic. But there's in the end of the Futuhat, there's a chapter 559, the last chapter, where he gives in Saj rhyme. He gives about 6 or 8 lines of rhyme that summarize that whole 100 pages, and there he really emphasizes how in our life here on earth that it's the pain and suffering are constantly accompanying our experience of love for many different reasons, but that it's above all, maybe the most obvious reasons, they make us turn to God. They require our tauba. If we were happy all the time, we forget God. We forget the haq, the reality. But there's also the thing that love is whole and never complete and never finished. And there too, we have fantasies that, oh, I found it. I found the love. If you're working with people at college age, they're convinced they've got to find the one, the right person to love, and will love them, one person. But of course, for all sorts of reasons, love is always, cool. At every moment, that there's a different facet of love at each point. And even in the famous ayah, it's not as simple as they translate it in English, because it begins with lillahi al-mashriqi wal-maghribi. So we're always turning from things that are becoming dark to things that are more light. And so we're turning around wherever we turn around from what is painful, what is hard to manage, what is difficult in all sorts of ways. We always have to be turning around to find that light. And so love is the engine of that process. Love is not a destination. Love is the dynamic that makes life worth living at wherever we are, under the hardest circumstances or under the most privileged ones. That stuff is very superficial compared to the motor of our connection to haq, to connection. I'll say that because you interview people from different traditions, and I realize that probably some of those traditions, if I keep saying God or Allah all the time, people, even with some of my younger students, they're not belonging to a tradition. So they think, oh, you're only talking to Muslims, or you're only talking to Christians or Jews, Abrahamic religions. But the experience of love is not something that's, it's by definition universal. And that's also what it makes it seem most valuable to write about that. And teach about it. Yeah.
Great. And in the Islamic tradition, we have a saying that is related to Sayyidah Zainab, where she says, "I saw nothing but beauty in the middle of a battle where all her family and friends were killed and were martyred." So this seeing the other رؤية المشهد الآخر, I remember this.
Yeah. In fact, I liked what you said about beauty, because although Ibn Arabi in this chapter only talks now and then about beauty, it's clear that beauty is inseparable from the awakening of love, shall we say. Huwa jamilun wa yuhibbul jamal. And so what I always did when I was teaching is I would always connect the Quran through the Islamic humanities, and particularly through poetry and music, because poetry and music are usually inseparable in the context of dhikr and of meditation and devotional practices. I would always connect those to how people, all of that beauty is how people acknowledge and respond to the divine love. And so now and over time, I discovered the kind of often great films, of which Iran has many great filmmakers. They were the modern day equivalents of the Masnavi or of Attar. I mean, I often taught both Attar and Rumi and Hafez. And films often today there are, that's why I'm trying to figure out ways I can take that practice of using films to illustrate scripture and classical religious tradition, and make that more widely available. I haven't quite figured out how to do that, but I just, what comes to mind, maybe it's relevant in Iran, but there's a great film by Majidi called Rang Khoda, and it's about a blind child, and takes place up in the Caspian, up in the north of Iran. But what the students don't realize, because in English they called it The Color of Paradise. Nice title, but it completely misses. Rangel Khada is just Sibqatullah, Ma'asanullahi Sibqatan. There's God's dying of the soul, D-Y-E-I-N-G, the taking the soul like you would a piece of cloth, and dyeing it in dunya, in this world, so that it begins to learn all of the asma. And you learn the asma not only because they're husna, but you learn them by their contraries and by where they lack. So this film is just, it really takes that ayah of the Quran, which is there in the title, and makes it concrete so we can see how people with different backgrounds and attitudes, how they all learn through the, because dying implies the application of great heat, of nar. You have to, there's actually a rug that they make, and they find all the raw materials on the earth, and they dye the wool, and make this. So the heat in life is suffering. It's a nar. It's the feeling of the fire, and so this film just takes the central themes of the Quran and explains them all in the life of a 10-year-old blind boy. And so things like that, and of course, Rumi, they took all sorts of stories and did the same thing. But I'm hoping that in the next generation, this kind of teaching through film, which, as I said, is just the equivalent of, say, Attar or Rumi or Hafez in our own time, I'm hoping that will catch on more, because in the world we live in today, film has music, it has stories, it's all there in a way that is not tied to any one culture or religion or tradition. Doesn't matter when, and I can show these films to my kids, I can show them to other people who are in their 70s, and they all understand, what's going on. So I have to say the same again is true of Rumi, but especially the Masnavi. But I just like to find new ways to teach using things that are out there in the world.
Okay, Professor, you mentioned God names and qualities, and the question is here, and I'll ask you more about love and how we relate it to love, but how can a seeker towards God feel the presence of his different names and qualities in his daily life and his path? So, and to connect with them, and if you give us examples, so how to connect with different names during our daily life situations.
Well, it's going to be different for everyone. I mean, if I mention a few things, each one will probably mean something to different auditors. But let me put this in the context of a story that just came up recently. Sufi Sheikh, I know, sent me a questionnaire that somebody had sent him. He was sharing it, and the person had asked, he wants to do a book. The story was, this person wants to do a book of, you give people 500 words, and he called it an elevator talk or an elevator pitch in English. This just means that in the time it takes to ride your elevator somewhere, how can you make a proof of God in that time in 500 words? How can you describe it? And well, having spent a lot of time in philosophy as well as in Irfan, I find that proofs are fairly boring and repetitive because there are only so many. So what I wanted to do was rather to look at, immediately what it triggered in me anyway, was the question of what is, of all the ayat that infinitely that we're experiencing, there's certain ones that stick with us in our lives. And we don't know until they come that they are, in a way, they're truly ayat because they never lose their power. They never lose their persuasiveness over us. And and they're very different. If I went back to my childhood, I can give you an example of what I'm saying. Is as a kid, I was very interested in everything about the meaning of the world and life and religious teachings and so forth. But I couldn't get, especially when I went to visit where my mother came from in the South in America, everybody wanted to know, had you known Jesus? Had you had a personal relationship with Jesus? This is the language of what they call evangelical Christian groups. It wasn't a kind of Christianity I knew from where I grew up, but it was where my mother was from. And I always felt left out because I never had that kind of experience. And the point was, well, I was experiencing God in all sorts of other ways. That was the only one that mattered to the people who raised that question. So what struck me about this question of how in 500 words or in 10 minutes, how can you awaken someone's awareness of the reality of God, not of the word. It's not about words and ideas, but about haq, about reality, not about truth, but haq, al-haq is what's real. And there, I think, the first thing I can say about that is the most memorable ayat are going to be ones that are not easy to talk about because they were already sort of unforgettable and miraculous when they came to you. One kind of them that I think is very common in people's lives, because I can see it just in college-age students I have, is when you meet someone, and it can be someone of a different age, color. I'm not talking here just about romance, but you meet someone or go to some place where you're already at home with that person, with that soul, with that place. And I suspect that if you were to ask me that before I started reading much, before I went off to college, places were probably, you mentioned the thing about beauty. Was it Hazrat Zainab, I think, who said that about beauty? And so no one explained that in religious terms when I was younger. But every time I got a chance to take the family on vacation, I sort of planned the family vacations from when I was a little kid. I would go to these national parks and things that it was only later in life that I realized I was going back to places that were sacred places, ziyarat gah, places for ziyarat for Native Americans for thousands of years. And I identified with that Native American heritage for various reasons with both on my mother's side and my father's side. There were a lot of Cherokee ancestors. So those unforgettable places in life, in nature to start with, where you feel you know God. You feel you're in the presence of something that's far beyond the ordinary world. And at first, everybody thinks that it's that person or that place that is the haq. But eventually you begin to realize that, and people hold on to it. They get very attached to the occasion of that, what they call tajalli or tejliyat, theophanies, manifestations of God. But after a while, you realize you can't hold on to it. You can't go back there. You won't have the same experience. So that's one thing where I think everyone has, at one time or another, in another culture, in beautiful places, and in particular with people who are literally our soulmates. I mean, it's a term of a New Age term that makes people cringe, but the truth is if you understand it in a deep sense of people whose spiritual affinities, there's this ya mu'allif al-qulub, it's the what you're experiencing there is mu'allif al-qulub, the divine power to marry souls and marry hearts so that people can go ahead and move ahead in life. I would say each of these kinds of experiences of haq is a kind of thread. If you can say, it's like it's put in your hand, and if you pull on it, then you spend the rest of your life exploring what that ayah contains. Another thing that I maybe particularly to academics, but there are certain books, in my experience, and again, I teach other future academics maybe, but books that fall off the shelves, so to speak. I've had so many times I've played some incredible qaris of the Quran, and the students who hear them don't know Arabic, they don't know the Quran, but they eventually end up becoming Muslim just through the, what is it, in Surah Al-Ma'idah towards the end, with the Masomia. Well, when they hear what is descended from God, you see their eyes fill up with tears. The Arabic isn't coming to me right away.
سمعوا ما أنزل إليهم من الحق.
Haq, yeah. So
you mean this?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's what I'm saying. When you hear what is sent down upon us from Al-Haq, that transforms somebody's life, and it fills their, and tears, spiritual writers and many traditions often talk about tears as the true sign of that kind of understanding of the alastu birabakum, if you will, that kind of primordial, some awakening in the soul, that ability. So I'm trying to think if there's anything I can mention. Yeah, so those are really common transformative experiences of Haq. The same goes for works of art, a particular music that might not, or a particular kind of zikr that might not affect other people the same way, but you'll see where everybody else is, Evallah, very motive. And then there'll be somebody in a corner here in the Majlis who's just suddenly hearing that music. There are lots of Sufi tales that talk about the same thing, but so that kind of experience. I remember when I was just learning Persian, and I was taking Anna Marie Schimmel's class in Sufism. So I was just beginning to study in grad school, the kind of things I went on and devoted my life to. But there's a story in the Gulistan that we were reading in the beginning Persian class about a donkey driver who was passing by the great mosque of Shiraz, and he heard the khatib saying something about and everybody in the mosque was just listening politely, and the donkey driver fell over dead. He was the one who had the listening to that particular ayah of the Quran. And in that class, so many of the and this was just my own experience of these things, but so many of the things that she was talking about and that Saadi was talking about as well, suddenly it was like the world opened up, and I couldn't sleep. And I was also reading Rilke, who's a kind of Rumi in German, if you will. And I was like transported like that donkey driver to another world for several weeks. It changed my life. Then I knew, this is the reality that all these books are talking about. Before that, I'd not really experienced the reality. Two other things that I'd mentioned that most people get to experience in some way or form. One is to be present at a birth. I don't know. I know, unfortunately, I'm not sure this applies to the mothers, but to everybody else who happens to be right there for a birth. It's like Surat al-Qadr. I'd been the night before my first child was born. Surat al-Qadr, I was listening to that with a friend, an incredible Turkish Qari. She had recordings, and they weren't from commercial ones. And then when he was born, it was like, again, I couldn't sleep. It was just like the gates of heaven had opened up, and here was this child. And I remember when I took him home then from the hospital on the subway, he had to stay in for some jaundice treatments and things. I was seeing with his eyes, I was seeing everybody on the subway as their pure soul, as they would be after death or before life. They're like 20, 25 years old. But, the bag ladies, everyone. And I'm never quite sure whether it was these people were relating to this infant that I was holding, or whether it was just I had a kind of an experience of rebirth through being there for the birth. And the other thing that's not unrelated to that is to be present with someone who's dying consciously, not somebody who's on a machine and completely out of it or whatever. But I've had students who set up hospice programs for people to when they're in their last few weeks of life. And there's something about being with someone who's dying at that time that's very, very like the instant of birth, that the sort of wall or the boundary, the veil, the hijab between this world and the world beyond, it becomes very thin when you're with someone who's dying and conscious of it. And there's not words that are exchanged, but there's just a communication, because people in that state are usually pretty happy, sad to be letting go of people that they know, but also very happy to be letting go of the effort and the struggle that's involved in life in dunya. And so those are, I hope that everything that I've mentioned as kind of dramatic ayat, if you will, are things that in one way or another, almost everybody gets to experience at some point in their life. Yeah.
Professor, maybe it's also related to the topic of mahdar. Urafa always talk about mahdar, and I recall an ayah where Zakaria enters the room of Hazrat Maryam, and when he sees all the fruits and the barakah and the graces, he says, من أين لك هذا? She says, هو من عند الله إن الله يرزق من يشاء بغير حساب. But I mean that there he says, هنالك دعا زكريا ربه. So he got use of that station, and there he prayed to God. So it's about the mahdar, and he used the mahdar very precisely to connect with God.
Yeah. Whether you say tejliyat or madahir or the word, there are many words for that kind of awareness of God's presence from hadara, but it's not the theology or the technology of the words. What's important is the actual presence. And again, I said they're like something that to understand it, you just have to keep working with that. You can't recreate it. It's a gift. It's a kind of wahb, a kind of gift of grace from the manna, minan root. And but it comes at the right times when we get bogged down in life, when life seems repetitive, when it seems frustrating. It's often at those points that we're given those gifts to hold on to. And so I find that the hardest part and the most important part is to awaken that kind of awareness in the students. Once they have that, then they'll see what the sacred books and sacred forms of communication, what they're saying. But otherwise, you're just reciting the words, and so
alive in the beginning, استجيبوا لله وللرسول إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم. So when you are alive, then you can go further.
Yeah, exactly. So that's my. I hope that's more than enough, probably. But everybody who's listening has to look for that in their own life and in their own experience.
You mentioned tears. So what's the relation between knowing truth and tears? So there's a very emotional state that happens here. So it's to do that. Truth is something that's related to a very deep feeling inside a person, or what's it exactly?
Well, there are many kinds of tears to start with. Let me be truthful. Yeah, but I think everyone has the experience of something that is so much larger than themselves, their ego, and it's gratitude, awe, and these things are all mixed up when we encounter Haq. When we're touched, you could say we're touched by the finger of God, if you will. It doesn't matter what language you give to it, but when what we're experiencing is the grace of, and the reaction to that is shukr, thankfulness. It's awe, haiba, just sometimes it can be almost scary when something like that happens. If you don't know what it is, often at first it's a kind of frightening thing. It's like in the Quranic account of Moses and the burning bush. It's like, what? Sort of like, not, this isn't the Moses who's saying, well, show your face. This is the Moses who's first discovering that kind of closeness of God in this tree or bush that doesn't burn up. So yeah, I think all of those things, when we cry or we're brought to tears by encountering, it's by definition that encounter with the Hak is unexpected, and the reactions. So the tearful reaction of that has to do, I think, clearly with both the gratitude, just that, we talk in words as though we understand when we're reciting the Quran or saying things about God or whatever, but the actual encounter is beyond words, and maybe that's most obvious when we have those kinds of experiences of music or poetry, because the aesthetic, the beautiful, is we know we can't respond. Words don't suffice to communicate what's going on in terms of that communication. So this is not tears of sadness. It's the opposite. It's tears of joy and recognition and connection. I think that's the rest of the time in life, we're in a state of, largely, if you could say in theological terms, of tanzih. We're aware of God, but it seems like something other, something beyond. And it's only when that suddenly, I mean, I'm not talking about tanzih and tashbih in terms of rhetoric. I'm talking about our experience of these two dimensions, Jamal and Jalal, of beauty and majesty. Well, God often seems majestic and beyond Jalal, but the Jamal, when we experience that, we can't say anything else but that we're just infinitely grateful, and that tears are the only way you acknowledge that. I mean, you think of your intimate relationships with your spouse or with your children, and so often just our grandchildren now, I can say, but when you watch them, you're just brought to tears often by just seeing how can this exist in this world. I go back to your dua or your saying of Zainab there, that how can this beauty, so infinite beauty, be here in this world? And so look, there's another kind of ayah which comes, I might as well mention it because it reminds me of Yaqub and Zuleika, which is when God steps in to rescue someone it can be from addiction, it can be from mental illness, it can be from impossible real life situations of hunger, desolation, loss. So that's another place where Hak steps in to help us. To literally just pick us up, to carry us. And those are in everyone's life. We have those kinds of experiences. We may or may not have been asking for that help, but the help often comes when we're not even asking for it, when we don't even realize the dangers we were in until after we've been rescued from them. And I think everyone has had that kind of experience where it's only obvious in retrospect that we didn't do it. That in all of those situations, you get your ego out of the way and you'll see. And when you see that, like an Allah Rama, that it was God who was doing the acting in those situations, again, you kind of have this inner just awe and astonishment that God knows better than we do of what we need at each point in life.
Professor, you mentioned earlier in your life when you were a child and then visiting sacred places or shrines or mosques, and
Well, it's just in nature.
My question is now, after all these years, you have such similar experiences when visiting such places and feeling and having some incidences also?
It's always there, and it's odd. My wife and I spent at least 10, 12 years of my life raising kids in France, teaching in France. It's a place, studying in Strasbourg. So that's one important part of my life. And we have lots of friends there from those different periods and times, and a lot of people we knew in Iran before the revolution who went off to France. And so we got back to France for the first time in 4 years. Because of COVID. We hadn't gotten back there in that long. And so I ended up going, mostly we went to places of ziyarah that I'd taken Oberlin students to years ago when I was teaching a course in Strasbourg on ziyarah and pilgrimage in Islam and Christianity. And yeah, what struck me was, once you're outside the big cities, there have been centuries in countries like that. And I don't mean to pick out France as opposed to Germany or Switzerland or other countries, but the modern world fades away, and what's left is these monuments of places where it doesn't matter what that you can go to, and again you feel like your life is transformed. This time we went to Chartres, to Vézelay, to Mont Saint Michel. These are medieval pilgrimage places, if you will, churches, but also places of pilgrimage. There's a labyrinth where the pilgrims would end their journey, their ziyarah, in Chartres Cathedral, that you'll see all over the world that people have imitated, because the labyrinth is such a wonderful image of life's journey, where you think you're going towards the center, but you never know from one moment to the next. It always leads you to the center, to al-Haq, but it takes often rather long journeys to get there. So yeah, so I would love to get back to, well, I feel the same when I get to Turkey. So we go as often as we can to teach, and then we can go to visit Konya in particular, and other places. So, but these.
Maulana and Konya, you have a certain special emotion there?
Yes. Well, the odd thing is I have more special emotion visiting Shams Tabriz than I do. The shrine for Maulana is such a museum and tourist center that it's very hard to find yourself in the right. I'd rather read the Masnavi or the Divan Shams, or that's where I can meet Maulana, Mola Rumi. But the masjid, the little neighborhood masjid, which is where people go to at least visit with Shams Tabriz, I know, and many of them know, well, he may or may not be buried there. That's not the point, but it's just that the devotion of the people who come from all over the world, and often in Turkey, peasants and poor people and all who come there, you're caught up in any place of ziyarah. You get your own dua is caught up in the wave of all of the prayers of the people around you. And I've only been to Kyoto twice now, to conferences in Japan in my life. But Kyoto is one of those places where the shrines have the same kind of spiritual power. And again, people come from all over the world. It's not because they're Buddhist or Shintoist or whatever. It's because the place itself has welcomed pilgrims and seekers for so long that their impress, their footprints are there. You're always there.
Professor, so we'd like to learn from you more. I'll impose here a question about death, and so we make prayer and we wishing you a very long life, many years of and faith. But at this age, how do you perceive it? Because normally many people fear it too much. And you talked about love. So what's a perception that you have about death? Because people, they say, وَمِنْ عَدْلِكَ مَهْرَبِي, So people they are afraid from the afterlife and how it will be, especially if God is the الاسم العدل والحكم العدل and all these stuff. And in the dua of Imam Zain al-Abidin, we say وَاجْعَلِ الْمَوْتَ مَأْنَسًا الَّذِينَ أَنَسُوا بِهِ. So it's about uns and ishtiyaq.
Well, I think it's all summed up in the, I don't think it's hadith, maybe it is, but the Sufi phrase, موتوا قبل أن تموت, die before you die, and nasu niyam, people are asleep. Well, in a way, that sleep is kind of a death. With a matun tabahu. So when they die, people are asleep. When they die, they wake up. Well, whether it be die before you die or that one, it's not talking about physical death. It's talking about boredom, routine, lack of seeking, lack of rediscovering our connection with life. And I would say that the question is, if somebody is afraid of that, what will take them out of that? And how can somebody overcome that kind of fear? And I think in my own experience, I have no recipe for how they do that, because I think the only way to overcome that fear of death is to realize that life is to have that experience, like the ones I've said, of our actual life, of al-hay. And Rumi time and again talks about al-hay, whether in obviously it's a common part of zikr, but he especially, when he's referring, his use of names of God is very subtle, and that's one that he comes back to again and again. And it's hard to translate when you say the living one or whatever, but I think that the only way to it depends on the person and the age, but I think one thing that might be helpful for some people, especially as they get older, is to go live in and serve people in a hospice. The hospices, again, exist in many parts of the world, but rather than going to hospital to die, people go to a hospice and they can get the medications they need to not be overcome by pain or whatever. But when they're beyond medical, curing, there's a kind of relaxation that sets in and a comfort with being with God. And people don't talk about it. It's just very obvious when you're with them, and whether you're having dinner with them or serving them or cleaning their room or whatever. Often hospices will encourage people to come in and help because they depend on volunteers. And I think that's one way that people who are afraid of dying, is to just go and see that that life is continuous. I suspect the other thing about being there at birth, of witnessing, it's not that life comes into the world so much as we're able to witness the life that is always there, that we took for granted. And that's why, in general, I think women are a lot more spiritually attuned than men, in my experience, because they can't lose that connection with that potential of life, of giving it, supporting it, taking care of it. You can make with what you can of that. That's just been my experience in life. Mm-hmm. So I one story I can say that I don't think that people that are afraid of dying are vocal about it. They articulate it. People that realize that life is before, during, and after this brief stint in dunya, they don't talk about it so much because it's obvious. So you don't wake up every morning and say, thank God for oxygen. It's like air, because we live in it all the time. We take it for granted. Well, the same way people who are not afraid of dying, for whom it seems kind of ridiculous, it's not about a belief about the afterlife. It's a knowing. It's a marifa. It's a ilm billah of life before, during, and after this. Those people, they're not going to I've discovered the answer. We're not going to die. No, because they know. They know in the same way we know that oxygen is good for us and we need it. And so it's it's a really good question practically how you can communicate or try to communicate with people who are afraid of dying. But I would say I've mentioned some of the things that came to my mind, but
But what about
generally,
people being afraid because that God will punish them on the bad, on the things that they did? So this is a good thing to feel about, or no?
well, um, well, Arhamul Rahimin, I, I, this is very much tied to the topic you started out with about God's love. And I think, again, if we're aware of how God is teaching us, then throughout life, then we're not afraid about what's going to come later, not that deeply afraid, because we know that He is, it's like an infinitely wise and loving parent who steps in to teach us through the consequences of our actions, inward actions as well as outward actions, all the time. And if we realize what these terms, especially anar, the term of the fire, then we realize how extreme, we don't forget our experiences with the fire. It's like a child who burns their hand in a stove or a chimney or something. And so when we're aware of God's taking care of us, punishment is not, it's probably the purification, the teaching of those kinds of things. Then there's two radically different, embedded in what you're asking about, they're two radically different kinds of questions. One is the question of what is our relationship to our actions and their consequences and the rewards or punishments, the thawab that comes, or the jaza that comes from those. That people, if they're intelligent in life and thoughtful, they'll see that happening all along. Then there's this deeper question, I think, that people have a real hard time with is how do certain people seem to get away with doing evil? And so this question about punishment is deeply embedded in our childlike images of evil and what a just world would look like. And I say childlike because inside us, we all think that we know better than God. Why does God let this or that evil person or thing or actions or whatever continue to exist? And I don't know how you cure someone of that commonplace thought that we all have, especially when bad things are done to us and our family and our country and so forth. But again, the best thing you can do in that circumstances is be with people who are so deeply imbued with faith and an awareness of God that their very presence is a perfect lesson. It's not, sometimes it's their words, but usually the people like that, the Quran calls them awliyaullah, la khawf alayhim wa la yahzanun. When you run into people like that, those worries you have somehow go where they go. You know, why am I not afraid of dying? Why am I not afraid of punishment and so forth? And so that, I think, is, you don't know when you're going to meet one of those people. I mean, many of them are celebrated and they're famous, the prophets and messengers, but in the real world and in the spiritual world, there are many people that we only know when we encounter them, have that quality of taking away. They really, let's see, Ibad Rahman, the Yamshuna ala ardi hawnan. I forget what surah is that from Tawbah. I'm not sure, but this reference to the about Allah, that when they pass quietly and softly through the world, and if the jahilun, the people who are in the state, and that unfortunate state you just evoked, those are the jahilun. And if they attack them, they address them. Yakuluna salam. You know, they just say salam. You know, so that one word not the word, but the being of salam, this beam of salam, of peace that they transmit in the world. That's what answers these questions about fear of dying and fear of punishment. And it's not a theory. You have to meet someone who's
يذكركم بالله رؤيته يعني.
what?
meet a person that يذكركم بالله رؤيته.
Yeah. That is, because often people just think the word term awliya, that's just the wulat in terms of the wilaya, the divine governance of the world, the hierarchies and all. But in terms of walaya, the divine love and guidance and perfection, above all, God works through beings like us, be they in the world or that we can get in touch with through prayer and so forth beyond this world. And those are they're the guides. I mean, they're the guides, but they're also in this world, they're the embodiment of God's love, of God's justice. Look, I could answer your question with all sorts of things from the Hadith and from the Quran, but it wouldn't take away the fear, those knowledge. I mean, just think of how many Hadith there are in Kafi. I often teach the usul of Kafi in classes. And there are all these Hadith about the Tawheed, the La ilaha illallah, that in the Mizan, that outbalances all the bad things we've done. And they're paradoxical sayings because we don't really know why is that? What does that mean? It's not talking about saying the word of Tawheed, but it's actually experiencing God that directly, that these other things are put in context. So the real way you get past that fear, it helps the study in the sense that once you've experienced God's closeness and God's mercy and God's compassion, then you will be able to recognize why these teachers had these hadith and these akhbar from the imams about these questions. But and then of course the Quran. But I think that's all I can say. Is go meet a wali, a waliya.
Going back to the notion of love, so when a person reads Quran, he feels or he reaches to this conclusion that the path of Iman and Ubudiyya is between fear and hope, al-khawf, والرجاء, and the mu'min should always balance his ibadah between al-raja and al-khawf. So the question is, so where love comes, is it in the middle, so a third emotion, or no, it's a level for the people of higher spiritual stations, or it's a source of khawf al-raja? So because if we split the ibadah only between khawf and raja, then we'll ask, so where love comes, is it the source, or it is for higher people, or where?
Yeah, well, in itself, there would be no way out. And that those, you have to think about those kinds of sayings, what kind of people and what circumstances they object. Because love, in the sense that the urafa, whether it be in Arabic or Persian, are talking about, love is not an emotion. Love is something, hakika. It's a reality. And to the extent that we experience in any of these contexts, we experience God's, well, the odd thing is, I was going to say God's hub, but hub is a kind of relational term. But the term that's more common in the Quran are the roots of Rahma. Well, many of the other divine names, Al-Wadud, must be at least a dozen of the Asma al-Husna that are directly expressions of love. But Rahma, Bismillah, Rahman, Rahim, all of that is the unconditional love that just as the mother has it for the child, no matter what the child is like, from the root of the womb, likewise, the Creator has that for all of creation, and, is again more forgiving and more loving and compassionate than we can imagine. That's why we need human embodiments of that Rahma. So I think one way of taking that statement, like you were looking at, is to look at what people dare to say in a majlis or in a khutbah or in a sermon, be it in a church or a synagogue or a khutbah in a mosque or whatever, what you say to the to the amma, to everybody when you're speaking generally. And something like that phrase may be very helpful. But when someone comes to you directly and asks you about these issues, then I think you have to speak a very different language, and you have to a more inclusive language of love and rahmah. Again, I just when I say you have to speak a more inclusive language, the people who do that are the great poets and musicians and teachers who find a kind of method of communication that goes beyond words and puts us in touch with the God is Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. And again, it's not that these people aren't obvious and you can't find them. One of the things about a traditional culture is they were known and revered much more than perhaps they are in the world today. Because after all, look, if you get online, you'll find thousands and tens of thousands of people claiming that kind of wisdom, that healing ability, and so forth. But chances are a tiny percentage of them have it, and the others are just, kind of making a living from that. So it's a personal encounter, and it's a personal relationship. And
our understanding about the notion of love, I guess this hadith will help. كنت كنزا مخفيا فأحببت أن أعرف فخلقت الخلق لكي أعرف. So it starts from there, from the divine love that is penetrating through all the مخلوقات, and then also in the ayah we have يحبهم, it comes before يحبونه. So I guess to understand the notion of love very deeply, we should look from the beginning that God is starting with it, or He's creating with it, I guess.
Yes, love is the root of the universe and the root of being, which is that's only one, that's in the things we read, that's a very central expression of it. But it doesn't matter if that's sahih or not sahih or whatever. It's absolutely true, no matter what. And likewise with the hadith of the wali, it's really, in the hadith of the wali, it says that there's nothing God loves more than us doing what our duties are. But anybody who does all of their duties perfectly, which is a few prophets, anybody does that, as they keep on practicing them, they become what then in the same hadith are called nawafil. And it's not like having a big callus on your forehead. Nawafil is a sense of what comes next in the caravan. It's the last of the caravan. So if we keep on practicing and doing our duties towards God, which becomes deeper and deeper, eventually we get to the point in which it says, then, according to Mar, then that person becomes God's hand with which he grasps, the tongue with which he speaks, and so on. That, in other words, the deep connection of love that makes this, that brings creation into being, also puts human beings in this position of being the instruments of ruju, of return. Not only that they're returning themselves, but they're the instruments of God's love for carrying back everyone else towards that source. And so really everything Ibn Arabi has to say, or whatever, is summed up in the hadith of the hidden treasure and the hadith of the wali, and or the nawafil, it's sometimes called, or the other one I might say is that kind of has that all-encompassing teaching tool is the hadith of, well, Ibn Arabi calls it the hadith of Jahannam, and it's in the Sahih books of I was sick and you didn't visit me, I was hungry and you didn't give me to drink, and so forth. When God is explaining to the soul at the last day where that soul fell short. But the secret of that hadith is not about judgment and good people who do these things and people who fail them. The secret of hadith is that the suffering and the fire which comes from not having those things done for us when they're needed, it generates something that we call compassion or mercy in ourselves. So without that, that's why Ibn Arabi calls it the hadith of Jahannam, because each time we fail to respond to God's call, we find ourselves in a kind of fire, a kind of Jahannam. But that is not punishment, it's awakening us to God's love. And without that experience of lack of compassion, of lack of love, we would not ourselves become the instruments of compassion. And in other words, it's my wife happens to be a psychologist, a therapist, whatever, but she gets to see up close all the time dealing with people's traumas around love, especially as children, whether they're adults or children among her patients, trauma are, let's just say, suffering, and trauma is an extreme case of it when you're young. There are two reactions we can always have to when people do wrong to us. We can want to get back at them, and we call that justice, whether it is or not. But the notions kids have of justice are very strange sometimes, very extreme, but they express what we all feel. So we can either learn to be avengers, or we can learn to be forgivers in life. And we have to learn a bit of both, because we can't understand other human beings, and in ourselves, most of those two sides are there, of either forgiving and loving, or of avenging and getting even and bringing justice into the world. So that hadith is, when people first see it, they think it's about God's is going to punish those who fail to respond to the sufferings of others in this world. But it may be that simply that what the hadith is pointing out is what we miss out on when we camp we put ourselves in the camp of those who are angry with God and want God to do all of the angry things to other people that we would do if we were powerful and strong enough. And of course, that thank God that we're usually not able to act out on our fantasies of revenge and getting even and so forth, which we have at all ages. They don't go away when you get older. So that's, look, we could talk about any one of these hadith for an hour and a half, because once you start filling in the real life examples, they're infinitely full of wisdom.
Yeah. Professor, and one thing that's related here, the more a person becomes a lover of God, his love to other people and creatures becomes more and wider. His rahmah, shafaqa, and ra'fa. And this is the sifat of prophets that we read. And this is something that I learned personally from you, or the friends and students who interact with you. They feel that there is a certain feeling of tawadu' or ihtiram or love from the teacher towards them. So this is actually a manifestation of true love to other people, that you feel it from people that they walk through the path.
Well, that's what Walaya is all about, is the wali, whether in this world or beyond, is the instrument of God's Walaya, al-wali, that there's those two divine names, al-wali, al-wali. We're talking here in al-wali, the one who is the friend, the guide, the comforter. It's such a vast field of expression of God's love and caring that words in any language are, like you said, with regard to shafaqa and Rahman and so forth. So the
wali, he can give the possibility of hidayah from all different peoples, from all their different cultures and the understandings and levels. So he can see their possibilities towards hidayah and towards going through the path, even if their dhahar was something very far.
And from the natural world, from all the other creatures. It's that in the hadith of the hidden treasure, it's khalaqtul khalq likai uraf. Well, khalq has these double or triple meanings. It can be just people, but it can also be all of creation. And These days, I think many of the college-age students, it's a changing culture as people realize that our amana for this world, our khalifa status in this world, turns us to pay more attention to the physical world around us and to the other creatures. We live in a funny world where up until now, human beings never had to be reminded to pay attention to the rest of Chalk because our dependence on animals, plants, minerals was just like so obvious. No matter where you live, whether you're a nomad or a farmer or a city person, wherever you knew this all came from God and it was there and usually now people have dogs or cats. That's kind of what they have for pets. But in the old days, you had to be responsible for all of those creatures. One of the things that's interesting about people who suffer many forms of either mental illness or extreme social isolation, often because of handicaps and things, is I can see this happening around that they have what they call support animals. It's a strange expression, but it is actually, I think, quite important. And it's something that children immediately relate to, is that unconditional love is the fitra of the rest of creation. Okay, I mean, it may be with regard to their species or whatever, but people have no trouble. People who are particularly, as I said, mentally troubled or physically, socially isolated, they often, a dog or a cat or a pet it doesn't have to be something they even have at home, but some animals are immediately, as with children, they're immediately felt to be an instrument of God's love in the world. And so, I forget what your underlying question was there a bit about the love of other people as opposed to or contrasted to the love of God. But whether it be from other people or from the rest of Chalk, that love is God's love. And Ibn Arabi makes this very clear in the first half, the first 50 pages or so of this chapter on Hub. I'm trying to think of other mystical poets, but at least in the Persian tradition, Iraqi. I know these poetry often as much through musical settings of it as through the actual reading the poems, but it's certainly something that is one of these things you're always looking for that is transhuman, that covers the whole human race, that everybody can relate to. And so I think that's kind of makes it
the time
particularly.
that's left, Professor. I'll just impose some other questions also.
Sure.
I'd like to ask you about the Imam Ali in Sufi sayings and then Sufi heritage. And you had an article which I recall about Imam Ali surrender and realization, Imam Ali on the conditions for true religious understanding, where you are explaining his khutbah to Kumil ibn Ziyad, where he starts with الناس ثلاثة عالم رباني.
His munajat almost rather than a khutbah, because he goes out into the cemetery of Kufa to tell him this. So it's not a public teaching. It's that I think that's very important. It's because the Nacho Balaga is full of khutbahs, but this one is, private, personal teaching, just to clarify that.
Yeah, so it had mysteries, mystical mysteries. That's why you wrote an article about it. So when he also أو صاحب الدنيا بأبدان أرواحها معلقة بالمحل الأعلى. So it has very beautiful meanings. So how is Imam Ali presented in Sufi studies, especially when reading Ibn Arabi? We see that he's talking about a very high spiritual and existential station for Imam Ali, especially when he says Imam al-Alam Sir al-Anbiya Ajma'in, which means the secret of all prophets. So what analysis you have, or kind of relation or something about Imam Ali that you'd like to share?
Or Bab of Madinat al-Ilm. So I it's a perfect question, because the situation of Ali here is much like the situation of many other central figures of other spiritual traditions, like the in Buddhism, certain bodhisattvas, or in Hinduism, they're somewhat equivalent in the sense that you come to know the reality of Ali essentially through surrendering to know, let's put it different, but to know him is not to master the writings that are attributed to him, that you could read Nahjul Balagha again and again, and it's clearly the voice of a very wise person, but you might say, well, if you were honest and not raised in a tradition of devotion to Ali, you might say, yes, but okay, this is, with the greatest respect, if you just had the writings, you would see this is a great teacher who's a moral philosopher, who's a incredibly courageous political and ethical leader. You could enumerate the manaqib of Ali from the writings, and yet in Sufism, Ali is always the source of, almost always, the source of the whole silsila, so that the wisdom that you're hoping to deepen begins and is brought into the world through Ali. So I'm not talking here about Shiite settings, but about Sufi settings. But it's important to realize that until for many centuries throughout the Middle Ages and down to the 19th century at least, Ali was so central in Sufi teachings, and the Ala Muhammad with him. I think that's, I would, if somebody had that question, I would almost immediately ask them to, well, what do you understand to be Ala Muhammad? Who are the true family of Muhammad, the people of Muhammad? And I think in that context, you don't have a separation of Ali from the Prophet, but sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and my apologies if I didn't say some of those honorific phrases earlier, but rather you see the descendants and the close friends, the awliya of the early Islam, as being in a way all the not those who just knew the Prophet, but those who lived his teaching. And then I think in that regard, what stands out in Ali is that his writing is not just spiritual teaching, but it's teaching put into all the domains of action on earth. If there were just an otherworldly Ali, it would be hard to separate him from all the other awliya, the other spiritual teachers. But what stands out with Ali is his commitment and his self-sacrifice to make that teaching a reality in which people can live. I would say that rather than being the spiritual founder or successor of the Prophet, I would just say that he's the person through whom the teachings of Muhammad, the divine teachings, become real. And this, in a way, separates Ali distinguishes him from the other khulafa of, if you will, the Sunni tradition, in the sense that we are aware of their leadership and of their activity publicly, but Ali manages to integrate all of that outward work of dunya with the highest spiritual awareness of God and of the deepest reality of the Prophet Muhammad. So in my own experience, I would say the more you come to know Ali, the more you come to know the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in a way, the deeper you probe into the seerah and the life of the Prophet and of the Quran, the deeper the more you understand the full reality of Ali and who Ali is. This is stuff I can say now that I'm not teaching, because I can't prove it from books. You have to discover it from your own experience. But the fact, when you ask about the role of Ali in the Sufi tariqas over centuries, these aren't rare groups. These are like at least much of the ummah, no matter where you're looking, from east to west or west to east. So I think what I've said here about Ali and the reality of Ali is enough to say that, and the surrender there is the letting that reality speak to your heart, not to speak to you through books. You can start with books, but the writings are not that many that have survived, and and they're not easy to translate in the things other than Arabic. But the reality of Ali is clear not only in the akhbar and in his writings, but in the lives and teachings of all of the imams. I mean, when the imams speak, more often than not, they speak as us, nahnu, we, which is an interesting parallel, because God in the Quran usually speaks as we, not as I. Only Moses gets the full I in the Quran, but the nahnu and that first person plural is the divine, all the names, all the realities there. Likewise, the imams, by and large, speak as we. And I know this is kind of more specific to perhaps people raised or aware of the Shiite tradition, but I think it's extremely important that you don't, it's la nufariqu bayna ahadin min rasulihi. Well, likewise with the imams, la nufariqu, what ayah is that from? Anyway, I'm trying to think. It's an ayah. I just don't remember the rest of the ayah right now.
It's an ayah, actually.
It is an ayah, I know, but I was just saying that likewise with the use of we by the imams, I would say it's very important that it's Jafar Hasadik said this, Muhammad Bakr said this, others close to them, Zainab's not an imam, but she is. I mean, she's a voice of the imams.
I mean, they are one light, one reality that's manifested in different personalities.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. I feel like really when you meet one of them, you're meeting Ali. And so that's, I could say more, but it would get deeper and deeper into my own personal experience rather than my reading or my reasoning. And but I've always appreciated, I don't know how you explain this, but from when I went to Sarajevo and met Sufis there, and then got as far as, that's about as far as, well, let's just take from Sarajevo to Lahore and Islamabad. Somehow, everywhere in between, when I greet people or I meet people, they would say, Ya Ali. These are mostly Sunnis. So I don't know what they saw but there's something there. Your question about Sufism and Ali is just as pertinent today, because these weren't high-class scholars and learned people. They were like ordinary people. You'd be walking in the mountains in Iran, and the first way you greet somebody, say, Ya Ali, and often I was by myself or with someone else who was not at all obviously even Muslim, so.
So it's the universal spirituality. It's not talking about very certain people or certain traditions.
No, it's not talking about fiqh tashayyu, it's talking about a deeper kind of fiqh. When you're talking about the Sufis and their relationship to Ali. But it's not to be neglected, because really for most people, their connection with what is above is through, and I've said this repeatedly in different ways, it's through people that we've met in this world or in dreams or in other forms of communication. that
Also,
are
Professor,
instruments of
in
God's.
the Rumi, we find this described beautifully about Ali when he says, "As Ali أموز إخلاص عمل شيء راح أقرأ مطهر أزدغال افتخار
Yeah.
هر نبي وهر ولي." Or when he says, "در شجاعت شیر ربانی هستی در مروت خود که دانست کیستی." So Rumi presents Ali in a very beautiful form, also just like your
Well, yeah, just so people are listening in who don't know it, but it's the last major story sequence at the very end of book one of the Masnavi that most of this is, taken from. And he also says good things about other people who are often tough. There's a tafrik or tafrika between them, but let's not go there. But yeah, one thing that's wonderful about Rumi is you feel like if he were in a Buddhist environment, or if he were in something in the Hindu world, that he would likewise be inclusive. He would really take to heart that phrase, "La nufariqu baina ahadin min rusuli," and that's easy to say and hard to practice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much, Professor. I wanted to ask you also about Al-Sahifa Sajjadiyya. Professor Chitek translated it in a very beautiful and literature form, and he called it the Psalms of Islam. So it's also to do about munajat. And there is a munajat al-muhibbin where it says, "Ilahi man dha alladhi dhaqa halawata mahabbatika farama minka badala." If you have a summary about the Sahifa Sajjadiyya and its importance in enhancing the life of spirituality or love.
It's interesting. Just a week ago, I was talking with one of my grad students here at Harvard. I work with, I'm not her advisor, but she wants to do her dissertation. She's finishing exams on the Sahifa Sajjadiyya. And I think it would be mostly a study of the manuscript, sort of how it spread throughout the Muslim world. But I think that's a perfect example. First of all, Bill Chittick's translation, I think it's the best one he ever did. And my mother, people in my family who don't know anything about Islam, I mean, distant family, just kind of, that's a book I can give to them, and they'll say, it's not an Islamic book, it's a book of prayers, and it's really speaks for people all over the world. And it's interesting that when you get a book like that, you don't need lots of footnotes to translate it. There are very, very few notes in Bill Chittick's translation of that one, because the sentiments of the prayers are ones that we all feel were in the kinds of situations that the du'as correspond to there. The student will be very gratified to hear you say it, because it's a work that needs to be much better known. And again, there's very little in it that you would say is just uniquely Shia teaching. I mean, that it's certainly true for all Muslims. It's available and useful for all of them. And it's very persuasive and meaningful for people beyond the world of Muslims. So I'm glad you asked me about it, and I highly recommend Bill Chittick's translation of it, as not just for the qualities of the translation, but the way he conveyed the contents of it in a language that is very accessible and doesn't need a lot of notes and explanation. Yeah.
Professor, today you mentioned Hafiz, Rumi, maybe Sa'di, Ma'attar, Ibn Arabi, and many other Sufi masters. I recall from your PhD, you translated The Wisdom of Throne of Mullah Sadra. What about Mullah Sadra? You still read Mullah Sadra and go back to him, and he's considered another presentation of Ibn Arabi's thoughts in combining between Burhan, Irfan, and Quran. So what about Mullah Sadra for you now? You still find him also one of the great Sufi or philosophers that you would like to read for him?
Well, he's a great philosopher, among the great philosophers for sure. And I often still have to advise people who ask questions when they're working on dissertations on him and so forth. As life went on, because I think from the last talk, I kind of came into Islam through teachers of Islamic philosophy. That wasn't necessarily what drew me, but they were the first people I met, like Mohsin Mahdi, my thesis advisor here at Harvard. So, and philosophy, I'd done years and years of study in Greek and German philosophy, learned German and learn Greek to read those philosophers. So that's where I was when I was 20s and 30s, early 30s. I have what it's almost everything we've talked about today is to talk about spiritual life and spiritual communication. Rather, I like the word communication rather than teaching, because communication is always a two-way street, whether it be vertical communication with God and the awliya, or whether it be with other people. So I appreciate the roles of philosophy for intellectuals and for theologians and religious teachers, because philosophy, like Mullah Sadra, is what can help us to understand very different perspectives and points of view. And this is the way that not only Mullah Sadra, but Ibn Sina and the other great Islamic philosophers, they were in the period after the Mongol invasions, people turned often to those philosophers to help them They were living in great empires, the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, filled with people from other religious traditions and from very different forms of Islam, whether it be the different Turk or whether it be the Sufi tariqas or whether it be Shia and Sunni and many subdivisions of Shia and Sunni. So philosophy can help rulers and the ulama that are supported by the rulers in helping people to understand each other and to get along and live peacefully. And God knows we still need that today, maybe more than ever on a global scale. But they help with understanding on the intellectual level and perhaps in the level of actions. Spiritual understanding is something else that is much more constantly demands our connection with God and with the instruments of God, the awliya. And that requires a different kind of communication. And it's not that difficult, because if communication works, again, there are all sorts of Quranic verses come to mind. But whenever, again, you see it on people's faces if somebody has translated really well, if someone is an amazing musician, then say you go to the ziyara of Maulana, the Urs on the 17th of December, and say Shahram Nazari just happens to be there and is playing for an audience. Well, there's communication. You can see it on the faces of those who are doing dhikr there or listening to that music or whatever. So partly it's the teaching I've had to carry out in many different fields, but I think I want to feel that when I'm gone, I will have touched as many lives as possible. And with Mullah Sadra or other philosophers, there's a restricted number of people there. But as I can see, this is what I learned from having children, is you have to speak a different language for different people. And I just want to communicate and pass along what I've learned and learn what other people learn with as many people as possible. And so philosophy is a useful tool, but it's not the best means of communication about spiritual.
It is narrow. Great. Thank you, Professor, for sharing all this knowledge, insight about love and spirituality and faith today. And we are, after 2 days, Ramadan is coming, so Ramadan Kareem. And so in the context of talking about the path of God and love, if you have any final word about how should we live Ramadan, or a certain special advice about Ramadan and the blessing of such days and Laylatul Qadr, let us finalize with it.
Nobody needs my advice. Just do it, But I love the coincidence this year of Nowruz and Ramadan, because Nowruz is the awareness of life returning everywhere. And Ramadan should be the same. Ramadan should be a celebration of life, not a not a departure from life, but a deepening of life. So I'll say Eid Mubarak for both, to you and those who listen. Yeah.